I don't know about you all, but I'm kind of over the great corset debate. And when I say corset, I'm referring to all foundational boned garments, be they true corsets, girdles, stays, or pairs of bodies. They're a sign of misogyny. They're a sign of feminism. They're another way for men to control women. They're a way for women to express themselves through fashion. They're super comfortable and supportive. They make women's uteruses fall out. We get it. They're controversial. Consider me enlightened. I still want one. And what's more, I think I can make a corset that kind of speaks to all of the above. Maybe not the uterus thing. I have this idea based on some white cotton sateen that I bought for a project that fell through that I want to do a take on a formal men's suit. I've always loved full white tie, which usually includes a black tuxedo or tails, white shirt and waistcoat, and namesake white tie. I want to make a white corset that's standing in for the white waistcoat. It's a kind of firmly feminist twist. Now's the part of the process where I was actually going to kind of like and ha over what kind of corset I was going to make. But then I realized that I actually cut my hair halfway through this process, and spoiler alert, I actually filmed this intro after making the thing, so I guess we'll just skip all the pretense. Okay, so this is Patterns of Fashion 5, like it was ever going to be anything else. And these are the bodies that I made. So these are often called the Dorthea bodies because they were found on Dorthea Sabina of Falls, Newburgh. They're also unsexily referred to as circa 1598 stitched bodies in watered silk. Whatever you prefer. So here is what the bodies look like IRL, and this is the actual pattern and sort of drawing of them. So the reason that I've chosen these bodies for this particular project is because, well, obviously I'm kind of more or less like early modern obsessed, but other than that, I do like the fact that, you know, from a purely modern, taken totally out of historical context perspective, I mean, this kind of looks like a phallus, right? I'm not alone in that. My mind's not just the dirtiest thing on the planet. I mean, when you put it in historical context, it really doesn't. Like, it just, you know, makes sense with the full silhouette. But yeah, just a little bit, right? And I also like the allusion to breasts right here with the way that the boning kind of ends just short of the cup area. And I don't know, I think that there's just something interesting there in all of that dialogue to be explored in a more modern context. So I'm really excited about this. I'm sure that I will also be making these someday in all of their historical realness, i.e. like hand stitching them and everything. For the purposes of today's video, because this is more of a modern take, I'm actually going to be making these primarily through machine stitching with a few hand finishing techniques. They're pretty simple from a patterning perspective. There's really just like 3 main pattern pieces. There's the front, which is cut on the fold, and then there's the back, which is, you know, you cut to. There's also this kind of shoulder strap right here. The originals have this kind of skirting right here around the back of the bodice, which is these little pieces right here, but I'm not going to be including those on this version because, I don't know, I just feel like they're kind of unnecessary for my purposes. So yeah, that's my decision. So yeah, let's get to the making. I scaled the pattern to its true size in Illustrator, tile printed, and taped the whole thing together. This is my first attempt at the paper pattern, and I mean, this is definitely not a perfect way of fitting something, obviously. This does not take the place of a mock-up for obvious reasons. But I don't know, I just like to kind of try the paper pattern on first so that I kind of know that I'm at least in the ballpark before I cut out muslin and all of that. And yeah, I'm not. So it's a good thing I did. So I printed this out at the exact scale that it is. So this is the size in theory of the set of bodies that's out there. But it's just a little bit too small for me. So I think I'm going to scale the whole thing up by about 10%. We'll see how that does. My fitting filming skills need some work, and so did my first toile. The scaled up size fit well at the waist, but was huge at the bust, so I pinned it in by about 2 inches. Then it became a hack job. There isn't a great way to fit a corset-like garment on oneself, so there was a lot of trial and error, taking the thing off, pinning, basting, unpicking, basically finding any way to take out all of the bust allotment and make the corset fit my flat frame. Okay, so it's been like a week since I've worked on this project. I did like another really short project in the meantime, but that's okay because I actually kind of like to leave a toile and then come back and revisit it after I'm like got some distance, you know? And I'm really glad I did because I totally thought that I was done with this and like, no, like this is so big still. I think that I was just like wanting to be over it. Yeah, I think that like this is good. This vibe is still there, but like minimized, so it's like tasteful. So yeah, I'm just going to take a little bit of this out. There does have to be some ease in here though, because I'm going to stitch those boning channels into this, and that will take up a little bit of extra space in the fabric, so there needs to be a little bit of ease. But at the same time, like this is really an era where these fit. I think that when you get a little bit later in corsetry, it's okay if they're just like a tad bit small or something, because you know you're kind of cinching in a little bit. There's a more of a lacing gap, but here there's no lacing gap and it's really meant to fit more like an actual bodice. I'm going to take it in again, like up here, and again, try to keep it the same down here. So wish me luck with that. I also noticed some gaping at the back shoulder, which I tried to fix by taking out some of the outer armhole circumference, but I was stubbornly attached to the overall pattern shape. Unfortunate foreshadowing there, I'm afraid. I finally got to a place where the whole thing fit, and I just optimistically believed that the shoulder gap wouldn't be an issue. As always, I traced the net pattern onto the fabric rather than pinning, using a heat erasing pen, which I tested out beforehand to make sure it would actually erase. I then flipped the whole thing over and traced the other side. I added seam allowance to the side seams and shoulder strap seams, but the rest is finished with a binding, so no seam allowance was necessary. The cotton self fabric is pretty thin, so I interlined it with a soft cotton canvas. I laid the canvas on the table, placed the self face up, and pinned around the pattern. I then flipped this over and used the pins as a guide to lay a piece of linen over the area that will get boning. The boning will be sandwiched in between the canvas and the linen. I roughly cut the pattern pieces apart so that I can work with each of them separately. I basted through all 3 layers along the outline of the boning area to keep all of the layers in place. I basted through the self and canvas layers around each pattern piece. From now on, these 2 layers will be treated as one. The boning I'm using is synthetic whalebone from Burnley and Trowbridge in 1/4 inch and 3/16 inch widths. This doesn't quite correspond perfectly with the 2 widths used in the original, but close enough. I followed a similar pattern as the original, minus the center front busk. I felt like a central piece running up the length of the bodice made the cups look droopy. So no thanks. I also eventually got rid of the weird peak you see in the center here. I slowly and methodically sewed each boning channel, leaving a generous tail at the beginning and end. These channels really do have to be stitched precisely, and if you're off by a couple of hairs, best just unpick and restitch. I pulled each top tail through the fabric to the back using a needle, and tied off with the corresponding back tail. then trimmed away the excess linen. I sewed a diagonal line along the bottom of the boning channels on either side of center front to close them. The channels at center front and back will be closed with the bottom binding. I chose white cotton for the lining, which was actually left over from the very first shift I ever made. It's thin and sheer, but so soft. I laid all of the self fabric pieces on top, right sides up, and basted around the edges using a different color thread from my first basting stitches. I left a very generous space at the side seam and shoulder seams to allow the seam allowance to be tucked in eventually. Before we get to the side seams though, it's eyelet time. I began by cutting away the seam allowance of the linen at center back. I then pressed the self fabric around the newly net linen and folded and pressed the lining seam allowance inward. This should make a nice crisp center back edge with the self and lining coming perfectly to the edge. I whipped the self and lining edges together, being very careful to only catch a thread or two from each side. The eyelets on the original have metal rings embedded in them. I used these jump rings that were a good size match. I used the exact same ring spacing as the original. I'll note that the picture shows spiral lacing, or single lacing cord that spirals through both sides of eyelets, with the top and bottom slightly offset as a result. This would drive me up a wall, so I used the same eyelet layout, but I'll be cross-lacing, like a shoelace, to ensure the top and bottom sit evenly. This was my first ringed eyelet, so the technique is a work in progress. I began by stitching the ring in place over the eyelet marking. I then pushed a stiletto through the center to create a hole without breaking any threads. I then passed a size 8 knitting needle through to make the hole bigger. I used 6-strand DMC cotton embroidery floss, passing it through the hole and then around the metal ring. I reinserted the knitting needle every couple of stitches to make sure the hole stayed nice and open. The result was okay. My edges got a little warped, but okay for a first attempt, I think. Okay, this may have been easier had I just sewn the lining and self separately and then bag-lined them, but I was trying out a historical technique, so bear with me. I first sewed the shoulder strap self together and pressed the seam allowance open. I then pulled the lining to the seam and pressed the seam allowance to the inside so that both sides butted up against each other. I whip stitched the lining seam in place. I don't know why I did it this way, but it worked, so yay, I guess. Next, I laid the back panels against the front panels, right sides together, and pinned the self fabric of the side seams. I held the lining out of the way as I stitched the side seams. Once the bodies were more or less whole, I sewed a 1/4 inch bias binding made from self fabric to the bottom edge, center back to center back. I then pulled the binding over the edge and fell stitched it to the back, covering the raw bottom edge of the bodies. If this sets your teeth on edge, I'm with you. I have no idea why I marked the bones directly on top of the self fabric like this. I had a boning layout I could have used. At least I was using good old super washable Crayola marker, which I'm very well versed at getting out of clothing. Oh well. I used a Dremel to sand the edges of the boning. I've heard a lot of mixed feelings whether boning edges should be sanded or not. I've had a lot of boning that has worked its way through its casing, so I'm all for it. Just be careful and make sure not to leave any burrs behind.
Lest anyone think that I actually had this under control, no, I am a child.
I first added boning to the tip of the front boning area. I used a zipper foot to seal off the top edge of the boning area. I was a total goob here and hand cranked the machine to make sure my stitching was super accurate. Okay, so I was all set and ready to let the fit issues go, but then I remembered that these bodies are featured in the Tudor Tailor. So here are the bodies. Well, they've done a few different variations of them. This is more like the Elizabethan bodies, but look at their pattern. Do you see how like theirs goes significantly to the side? That's not the way to say that. Theirs is significantly diagonal right here in the straps. Mine, which followed Janet Arnold's pattern, is much more straight up and down. So that is very clearly where the fit issues are coming in, which I kind of knew going in. Like, I think that's the most disappointing part of this whole thing, is that I saw that in the mock-up and I kind of thought to myself, like, that doesn't look right. Like this doesn't look right. This looks way too like straight up and down. It should be a little bit more like bias cut like this. That would make it fit better. But I really just like trusted what I was seeing here and thought, nope, Janet Arnold knows better. Surely this is going to work out somehow. I saw it and I didn't do anything. So, I mean, I don't really even know what the lesson is here. Your eyes more than what you believe with your brain or something. I don't know. I'm going to, I think, create a dramatic dart here. So something like that, and that will help to give this more of that angled appearance. I felled the dart down. Honestly, this turned out fine. Once that mess was sorted, I sewed the bias binding to the armhole. This was the part of the project I was most nervous about. The cups need to be symmetrical, and the stitching needs to be right up against the bones to properly secure them. I'm not even ashamed of my hand cranking here. I added another bias binding around the neckline. So why are corsets such a thing? Most people with breasts will tell you that support is necessary, and even modern bras sometimes fall short of the task. Corsets, or stays, or pairs of bodies are a traditional female garment, and goodness knows men like to pick apart anything that falls under women's stuff, which means the garment gains a certain amount of notoriety/infamy and becomes that much more interesting. Add to that a hefty portion of romanticism over bygone eras, and poof, you have generations of 20th and 21st century people running around in outdated underwear. As always, I had a lot of fun with this project, and I hope you did too. If so, I always appreciate a thumbs up, and of course, hit the subscribe button to join me on my next adventure. I'm thinking I need a proper tux to go with these bodies, so that is on the horizon, as well as some other fun videos. Bye!